I'm as guilty as can be, and there's more.
She was like a spider, waiting to prey.
There's a lot of times you have a rough childhood and you turn out to be a doctor or a lawyer. They don't all turn out to be murderers.
And no serial killer.
She needed somebody to care for her. I think that's all Aileen ever wanted.
Her words were, "It's a good thing Florida has the death penalty, because if it didn't," she said, "I would kill again."
There's just something inside her. I believe she needed to die.
In August 2002, just weeks before her scheduled execution, Aileen Carol Wuornos sat in her Florida jail cell and wrote a confession to God.
Dear Lord Jesus, I know I've done some wicked things in my life, and Lord God, I know I deserve every bit of the rot of hell.
In a neat, even hand, she cataloged her sins: theft, prostitution, and the murder of 7 men.
I need to bring myself to your throne, begging if you'd forgive me for all the overwhelming evil I've done in this world.
She had been convicted and sentenced to death for 6 of the murders. Now, she had decided to halt her final appeals and accept her fate.
There's no chance in keeping me alive or anything, because I kill again. I have hate crawling through my system.
This letter offers a glimpse into a violent mind and at the life that spawned a rare kind of criminal: a female serial killer.
Let me begin my confessions to you with when I was a child.
Aileen was born February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan, 26 miles north of Detroit. She seemed destined for a life of turmoil. Her parents, Diane and Leo Pittman, had a violent and tumultuous marriage. They had eloped in January 1954, when Diane was just 14.
Diane was very young when she fell in love with Leo, who was a bit of a bad lot. Certainly her father and mother did not approve of this liaison, but the next thing you know, they're married.
The newlyweds' first child, Keith, was born in March 1955. Soon after, Leo was arrested for a variety of petty crimes. To avoid prison, he was allowed to enlist in the Army. He left home, and Diane took the opportunity to flee. 7 months later, she gave birth to Aileen.
Diane tried to struggle along with 2 young children on her own for a while, but ultimately ran home to Mum and Dad.
Diane abandoned Aileen and Keith and would never reclaim them. Aileen would never meet her father. 10 years later, he would be found guilty of raping a 7-year-old girl. In 1969, he hanged himself in his Kansas prison cell. Diane's parents, Lowry and Britta Wuornos, adopted their 2 grandchildren and raised them along with their own son Barry and daughter Lori in nearby Troy, Michigan. Mr. Wuornos was a hard drinker with a volatile temper.
My dad was very strict. We would get spankings with a belt, with our pants down, to discipline us.
He never did anything to the neighborhood kids, but to them. I mean, he was always mean to Aileen and Keith, always.
Aileen grew into a beautiful little girl with blonde hair and lively brown eyes. But her angelic looks could not mask a roiling anger.
She suffered from explosive temper tantrums that came out of nowhere, and she would just blow up with no provocation. Well, needless to say, other children didn't respond well to this. They were somewhat afraid of her.
Aileen's closest companion was her brother, Keith. On the surface, they seemed to have a typical sibling relationship.
Sometimes they were like really good friends, and other times it was like they hated each other. They'd fight like 2 boys almost, you know, fist fight and everything else.
It seemed to be that kind of situation where, you know, we can argue amongst ourselves, but dare anyone else to try to say something bad about my sister or brother. They had a very important bond.
But underneath was a much stranger dynamic.
Lord Jesus, will you please forgive me for this, all my sexual sins I engaged in as a child.
By the time Aileen was 10, the two children began to experiment sexually with each other.
She did have sex with Keith. Apparently it was consensual, and this did happen on several occasions, and yes, one of the neighborhood boys witnessed it.
At the time, I didn't really know it was wrong, what they were doing, you know. And yeah, they had sex.
Aileen seemed quite happy and willing participant in those activities. They were so young. You can't say innocent, but in a way it was innocent.
Eileen's attention soon moved on to other boys. She would sneak out of the house and meet up with the neighborhood kids at a gathering spot called The Pits.
We used to go there and hang out, and every now and then the police would come in and chase you out because you really weren't supposed to be there.
We'd get big bonfires going, and we'd have the music from everybody's cars going. Now we had a riot there. We did. We had a really good time at the Pits.
At first, Aileen wasn't accepted by the crowd, but she soon found a way to fit in. By the time Aileen was 11 years old, she was having sex with boys in exchange for loose change or cigarettes.
When she realized that sex, which wasn't such a big deal to her, could earn her money, then she quickly turned it into a little business. She used the money to buy drugs and beer, to try to buy friends.
When they first said she's a prostitute, I thought, what the hell's a prostitute? And then she'd come back with all this money and say, oh, okay.
All the boys knew that they would have sex in one way or another with her. They treated her with no respect.
The troubled young girl was performing poorly in school, and while her grandparents had no idea she was selling her body, they knew that Aileen was getting into trouble at the Pits. Her clashes with her grandfather grew more intense. Aileen would often run away with her brother to escape his wrath.
Eventually they would find him, catch him, put him in, I think it was like a reform school or something, keep him for a while, and then they'd come back home.
Having had sex with so many boys as a kid, no wonder I eventually wound up getting raped.
In 1970, at the age of 14, Aileen became pregnant. She would later claim that an older man from the neighborhood had raped her.
She was probably 6 months pregnant before the grandparents learned of what had happened. And Lowry immediately wanted her to give up the baby for adoption. There was no if, and, or but about the situation.
Eileen's grandparents sent her to a home for unwed mothers to have the child. In March 1971, she gave birth to a baby boy who was immediately put up for adoption.
She could never have raised a child. It was not the adoption that she objected to. It was the child being taken without her seeing it, without her having anybody even to talk with her about it.
After they sent her away to have the baby, and she came back home, that's when it was real bad. She ran away immediately, I think, and was caught by authorities, sent to juvenile home for a while.
Several months later, after Aileen had returned home, her grandmother Britta Wuornos passed away. Her grandfather decided that he'd had enough of the difficult teenager.
Shortly after his grandmother's death, her grandfather basically kicked her out of the house.
He said, don't you step another foot back in this house, because I can't deal with you kids again.
Aileen and Keith left home at the same time. He stayed with friends in the neighborhood, and she struck out on her own, using the only tools she knew to survive.
So at 15, she hit the road and earned her living prostituting.
When she lived on the road, she truly lived on the road. She didn't have nowhere to go.
I think most people in the neighborhood were probably happy that she was gone. It sounds bad now, but she didn't have that many friends anyway.
Aileen Wuornos would spend the next 2 decades trying to find a place to call home, even as her life spiraled more and more out of control. In 1971, 15-year-old Aileen Wuornos was kicked out of her grandparents' house in Troy, Michigan. The troubled teenager headed west, hitchhiking on the interstates.
Lord, I hit the road at around 16, aimlessly everywhere but going nowhere.
She was really just wandering, drifting aimlessly from staying with one person to staying with another, you know, kind of hippie life, if you will. It was really like an extended version of the Lost Weekend. Drugs, booze, hitchhiking, partying.
For 5 years, she drifted around the country, eventually finding her way to Colorado. There, she traded on her looks in the dangerous world of prostitution.
A lot of these people, when they can get what they want out of you, then they get mean with you. Because that's a rough life, especially being a girl like she was.
In her mind, that was the best she could do. That's what she was good at. That's what she could earn a living at. That was all she could earn a living at.
She didn't wear the leather skirts and the mini skirts and the stiletto heels. She wore shorts and t-shirts.
Eileen's wild ways and explosive temper often got her in trouble with the law. The teenager was arrested for disorderly conduct and wanted for grand larceny. Finally, in early 1976, she settled in Daytona Beach, Florida.
I think that the promise of sun and fun is the traditional lure of Florida, and I don't think it was any different for Aileen.
She left Michigan because it was so cold on her feet and the hitchhiking stuff, and she went to Florida so she could sleep on the beach and still do her prostitution.
I wound up playing the harlot out there and committing adultery, I'm sure, since I went to bed with so many married men, while I thieved and ripped them off too.
Her first year in the Sunshine State was a turbulent one. The 20-year-old received word that her grandfather had been found dead in his garage in Michigan, an apparent suicide. That spring, Aileen abruptly married a 70-year-old retiree named Lewis Fell. Aileen met Lewis when he picked her up hitchhiking.
I had gotten a letter from her when she married that old man. That was so funny. She married him so she wouldn't have to be on the road is all.
He was pretty well off, and perhaps it was her best chance of some kind of normal life because he was spending money on her, but she was not able to curtail those outbursts and to behave like a normal person.
The marriage ended after only 9 weeks. Lewis filed for divorce, claiming Aileen had hit him with his cane when he stopped giving her spending money. And then came the most difficult blow. In July 1976, her brother Keith died of throat cancer.
She loved Keith a lot. She was, of course, devastated.
He was her ally, and for all the fighting that went on between them, he stood by her. He was loyal to her.
Aileen drowned her sorrows in alcohol and went right back to her vagabond lifestyle. She worked the exit ramps up and down the Florida highways, taking on customers wherever she could.
That's when I didn't really want to hear from her because I didn't know where she was going to be next, what she was going to do, and could she be dead.
In 1978, at the age of 22, Aileen decided she couldn't take any more of her hardscrabble existence. One afternoon, she took a .22 caliber pistol and shot herself in the abdomen. At the hospital, she told doctors it was not the first time she had attempted suicide. She recovered from the gunshot wound, but she received minimal psychological counseling. 3 years later, in May 1981, in a drunken stupor, she robbed this Edgewater, Florida mini-mart at gunpoint.
She had had an argument, I guess, with this fellow who she had lived with for about a year. And she was trying to get his attention in whatever way to see how he would react if she did a robbery.
So she went into a little mini-mart, clutching her gun and wearing a bikini, if you can believe it, and held the gun in front of the woman cashier, frightened the cashier to death, and asked for the money that was in the till.
She left the store, went down US 1, a car she was in, an old car, overheated, and that's why she stopped. And by then, they had a description out on her, and the police were everywhere, and they picked her up.
Aileen pleaded guilty to robbery with a weapon and was sentenced to 3 years in prison. She spent her time reading the Bible, complaining about being shut in with lesbian inmates, and waiting to get back together with her boyfriend. Upon her release in 1983, the 27-year-old returned to a life of alcohol, hitchhiking, and prostitution. It was a life not many wanted to share.
She had this feeling that any relationship with a man was not going to last. That something was going to happen, they were going to drop her or dump her, whatever.
Desperate for a connection, she turned to women and quickly found acceptance.
I became a lesbian around 28, and all of it would get me in a world of trouble.
Aileen began cruising the biker bars of South Florida during the spring of 1986. Dubbed Lee by her new circle of acquaintances, she soon found a girlfriend, 24-year-old Tyra Moore.
Aileen met Tyra Moore, who was to be the most important romantic relationship in her entire life, in a biker bar.
She was in there alone, I was in there alone. We started a conversation and she went home with me that night.
They shut the bedroom door and they stayed in the bedroom for an entire weekend and didn't emerge really, except for to grab some food. So from then on they became inseparable. That was the anchor Aileen had been looking for.
I don't know that she was gay. I think maybe she turned herself that way just to see if that way of life would work for her.
The two women lived like nomads, changing homes frequently, from a room in a friend's apartment, to a trailer, to motel rooms, sometimes the woods. By day, Aileen worked the highways, earning a few $100s a week.
Once I found out she was prostituting, I tried everything I could to have her stop doing that, because for one, it's not safe, and that I did care about her. But she never gave it up.
Aileen would come home evenings and weekends. She and Ty would spend time watching television or drinking at a bar. But her anger was always just below the surface.
There was numerous times that her and I would go to a grocery store and somebody would look at her wrong and she would just like fly off the handle at them. Like, what are you looking at me for? And it was very embarrassing a lot of times.
Despite Aileen's temper, Ty stayed with her. Aileen called her wife, and seemed happy to be providing for her, creating their own kind of home.
Aileen is so desperate in her life to be loved by somebody. Nobody's ever unconditionally loved her back, and she was just trying to hold on to that.
At 33, Aileen Wuornos had finally found the companionship she'd always craved, and she would do whatever it took to keep it from slipping away. By the fall of 1989, Aileen Wuornos had been working the Florida highways as a prostitute for more than a decade. The wear and tear of her lifestyle was beginning to show on the 33-year-old.
To say that the bloom was off the rose would be an understatement. Her looks had taken a beating. She did not have the natural tools with which to bring in the clients.
Her girlfriend Tyra worked on and off cleaning motel rooms, and the lack of money was causing stress in their relationship. But Aileen was desperate to keep her companion by her side.
It seemed like I was all she had, and I felt if I left, she wouldn't have anything.
She really felt under threat, big time, that Tyra might leave her and that she would be all on her own again, and she couldn't allow that to happen.
I completely lost it, Lord. Hypnotically entranced in our companionship, so deeply lost in its same-sex relationship, causing me then to do the unthinkable.
On the night of November 30th, 1989, just outside Tampa, Wuornos was picked up by a 51-year-old electronics repairman named Richard Mallory.
He was heading towards Daytona Beach for a weekend of partying. She met him, propositioned him, he said yes. They agreed to have sex.
They parked the car in the woods near I-95 and Route 1 and drank and talked until dawn. It was only then that Wuornos pulled out the .22 caliber handgun she had brought with her and shot Mallory 4 times in the chest and back. After rifling through her victim's pockets and stealing whatever money he had, Wuornos covered his lifeless body with carpet she found nearby and drove away in his car. When she got home, she told Tyra what she had done.
She had told me that she had killed someone, and I didn't believe her because of the way she talked about it. I didn't think she had it in her, really.
Later that day, Aileen and her girlfriend piled all their possessions into Mallory's car, abandoned their room, and moved into a new place.
Then Aileen took the car, methodically wiped clean of fingerprints, and dumped the things that were in the car, covered them with sand, and then dumped the car at yet another site.
Police would find Mallory's abandoned car the next day, and his corpse 2 weeks later in Volusia County. But with no leads, the case remained cold. Tyra never went to the police to report her lover's confession and stayed by Wuornos' side.
I thought at that time that, okay, she has all the frustration out of her system for whatever reason she hated society, that she'll be okay. But obviously she wasn't. Obviously it was just the turning point, and she figured she got away with it once, she would keep doing it.
After a 6-month break, Wuornos would strike 3 more times, robbing and killing David Spears, Charles Carskadden, and Peter Sims in much the same way.
She would either find her victims when she picked them up as a John, or she would stand by abandoned cars on the side of the road and motorists would stop and pull over thinking that she was a female in distress.
Once she'd decided this was going to be a victim, ascertaining that they had the cash that she needed, she was all ready to go.
Some serial killers include rape or torture. In this case, Aileen included robbery. She was making money.
She would go home with these bills of money and wave them at Tyra and say, look, now I can pay the rent. Look, now we can party. Everything's going to be all right.
I was afraid of her after a while, that if I tried to leave, that she would, do something.
The string of murders baffled the police. At first, they weren't even certain they were dealing with one killer.
The fact that we did not catch her is simply because she was unique in her style, that she was a female, that she did leave the body away from the car, and it made it hard to put it all together.
On July 4th, 1990, Wuornos had a close call when she and Tyra were involved in an accident while driving a car she had stolen from her 4th victim.
We were riding out through the country. Guess I was going a little fast around a turn and rolled the car.
The women were unharmed, but when help arrived, Aileen realized the accident could mean trouble.
Aileen then wrenched the rear license plate off with her bare hands and threw it into the bushes.
When one of the fire rescue people approached the females, the female was belligerent to her and they ran off.
I probably had my suspicions about that it could be a vehicle of someone that she murdered. But I never questioned her about it because, like I said, you don't want to make her mad.
Police quickly learned that the car was registered to Peter Sims, who had been reported missing 3 weeks earlier. But they were unable to track down the 2 women, who had already hitchhiked their way back to Daytona.
A drawing was done at that time of the 2 of them. The police were trying to weigh the benefits of getting the drawings out there against the fear that it would tip off the women and they would run. So they were in one local paper and that was it at that time, and nothing happened.
Over the next 5 months, Wuornos would kill another 3 men. It was now becoming apparent to Florida authorities that they had a serial killer on their hands. The victims were found in 5 different counties, all shot with a .22 caliber handgun. Desperate for leads, police decided to release the sketches of the two women statewide.
When the composites are put in the newspaper, we start getting a lot of calls from the Daytona Beach area, from the Port Orange area, indicating that they were seen.
At that point, Tyra fled the state, heading north to Pennsylvania to stay with her sister, and leaving Aileen to fend for herself.
I knew I had nothing to do with any of this, and I had to leave. It's like I have to get away from her. You know, she's not going to ruin my life.
Aileen was on her own, desolate. She didn't know the game was up, but she was out of steam, she was out of money, she was out of energy, she was out of strength, she was heartbroken because Tyra had left her.
In late December, detectives discovered pawn shop records of items Wuornos had stolen from her victims. It was the break police had been looking for.
She was identified through her thumbprint on the pawn shop ticket.
Police now knew they were looking for Aileen Wuornos. They followed her for about 2 days. Then, they made their move.
We learned that the bar where she's been hanging out for the last 24 hours, they're going to have a large pig roast and a biker gathering. So, with her history, we're concerned that she's going to end up on the back of a bike and be off and we'll never find her again.
On January 9th, 1991, at this Port Orange bar, aptly named the Last Resort, Aileen Wuornos was finally arrested. She would soon find herself caught between wanting to fight her case and needing to protect the woman she loved.
Tyra, listen, you just go ahead and do what you gotta do, okay?
Between November 1989 and November 1990, Aileen Wuornos killed 7 men along the highways of Central Florida. The 34-year-old was finally arrested in a biker bar near Daytona Beach.
She would have continued, absolutely. Aileen was a predator just like any other serial killer. She was out there to take lives for her own personal gain.
With Wuornos now in custody, investigators turned their attention to finding her lover, Tyra Moore. They quickly tracked her down near Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania.
Well, I was very cooperative. Anything I knew, I told them. I knew I didn't have anything to hide, because I knew I was nowhere around her when she did any of this.
We really had no evidence that she was knowingly participating in the robberies or the killings.
Tyra did confess to knowing about at least one of the murders, yet the prosecution decided not to charge her with any crime. But that leniency would come with a catch. Moore would have to help the investigators ensnare her former lover.
They arranged me to write a letter to Lee and give her the phone number of the motel I was staying at so she could call me, and she did.
Their first call came on January 14th.
Hey, Ty?
Yeah.
What are you doing?
Nothing. What the hell are you doing?
Nothing. I'm sitting here in jail.
Yeah, it's what I heard.
I wanted to know where she was going with it. Is she going to try to pin this on me, or is she going to, confess?
Tyra told Aileen that police were harassing her family.
There's been officials up at my parents' house asking some questions.
Uh-oh.
And I'm getting scared.
I think what happened, there was pictures in the newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a case of mistaken identity.
As the calls continued, Tyra became more insistent that the police were after her and her family. Wuornos began to suspect she was being tricked.
Listen, I gotta ask you something. Is there anybody in that room?
No, just me.
What?
What?
Is there anybody in your room?
No.
But over time, as she sat in jail and listened to her seemingly desperate lover, Aileen became less suspicious and more determined to protect Tyra.
I don't know whether I should keep on living or if I should...
No, Ty, listen.
What?
You go ahead and let them know what you need to know. If you want to know or anything, you're innocent. Listen, if I have to confess, I will.
On January 16th, 1991, Aileen took matters into her own hands.
There's no confessing, and there's nothing there is one.
For more than 3 hours, Aileen sat in a jailhouse confession room talking to investigators, smoking, laughing, crying, spilling her story to protect her lover.
It was a rambling, obviously spontaneous sometimes somewhat disconnected dissertation.
I'm telling you, to the bottom of my heart, I'm telling you the truth about everything. I mean, I can't be any truthful.
Throughout, Wuornos blatantly disregarded the advice of the public defender assigned to represent her.
I told you, I don't care if you're here or not, I just want to let them understand that Tyra is very innocent. I don't want an innocent person hurt.
Wuornos admitted to killing 7 men, though she claimed to have done so in self-defense.
They got violent with me and I decided to defend myself. I wasn't going to let them beat the shit out of here and kill me either.
In the end, Aileen Wuornos was charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder. The story of the so-called damsel of death instantly became a national sensation.
It was a huge, huge story because women simply don't kill the way Aileen Wuornos did. They kill intimates, they kill loved ones. They do not kill strangers.
It shocked me, but to know how much she hated men and they used her and she used them, I wouldn't have put it past her.
Book and movie offers poured in to detectives, relatives, and even Wuornos herself.
I tried to explain to her what our laws say about benefiting from your own deeds, so to speak, or misdeeds. And I said, Aileen, you can do this. They may even produce a movie or a TV show, whatever. You won't get enough money out of that to buy a pack of cigarettes.
In one of the strangest twists in an already strange case, Wuornos caught the attention of a 44-year-old born-again Christian from Ocala, Florida, named Arlene Pralley.
My husband and I saw her picture in the paper down here, and we just felt compelled from God to reach out to her. We didn't care about guilt or innocence.
Pralley began telling anyone who would listen about Aileen's true good nature. She became fixated on visiting Wuornos in jail.
She was unable to visit because of the fact that you had to be a relation to the person in jail. So I said to her, if you adopt Lee, you will be her mother and you'll be getting visits.
On November 7th, 1991, Arlene Pralley and her husband legally adopted Aileen Wuornos. Pralley's influence became a thorn in the side of Wuornos' public defender.
Aileen would refuse to cooperate with me or refuse to communicate at all unless I had some contact with Arlene. If I wanted a cooperative client, I had to be taking care of Arlene's needs, whatever they were at any given time.
On January 15th, 1992, a year after her arrest, 35-year-old Aileen Wuornos went on trial in Volusia County, Florida, for the murder of Richard Mallory.
Our strategy was to convince the jury that Aileen Wuornos had acted in self-defense.
And then you flip to the other side, this arch-evil woman who is preying on men and murdering them in cold blood.
The evidence against Wuornos was overwhelming, but for the defendant herself, the most painful moment came when her former lover, Tyra Moore, took the stand to testify against her.
Aileen was desperately trying to catch Tyra's eye, but Tyra very pointedly walked up to the witness stand and did not make eye contact with Aileen.
I'm not sure that Lee fully understood that Tyra had turned on her until she saw her in the courtroom testifying. I think that's when it hit her, what had happened.
She did shed some tears because Tyra basically sat up there and betrayed her.
I knew I was doing the right thing. The one thing I am sorry about that is I never did go to the police after the first one, because maybe the other 6 would still be alive.
When it came time for the defense to make its case, Aileen proved to be her own worst enemy.
I'm scared of my life in Volusia County Jail. I'm tired of them trying to kill me there.
I explained to her very, very clearly on numerous occasions that because of her personality, her inability to maintain calm over any period of time, that she could very well be destroyed on the stand.
Wuornos, who was the only witness to testify on her behalf, claimed that Richard Mallory had raped and tortured her, and that she shot him in self-defense.
He was coming toward me with his right arm, I believe, and I shot immediately, and I think I shot twice, as fast as I could.
But during her cross-examination, her hair-trigger mood swings gave the jury a glimpse of the violent temper that had plagued her throughout her life.
She really was doing her best acting job. She tried to appear to be a sweet, innocent lady from time to time, and other times she would lapse back into a pretty tough woman. Her actions, coupled with her words, just made her unbelievable.
On January 27th, after deliberating for less than 2 hours, the jury returned with their verdict.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Aileen Carol Wuornos, guilty of first-degree premeditated murder and first-degree felony murder of Richard Mallard.
As the jury exited the courtroom, Wuornos lashed out at them.
I was raped. I hope you get raped. Scumbags of America.
Her fury was still fresh in the jurors' minds as the penalty phase of the trial began the next day. Defense experts testified that Wuornos suffered from a mental illness known as borderline personality disorder, and therefore, her life should be spared. The jury was not swayed. On January 31st, 1992, Aileen Wuornos was sentenced to death. But her violent tale was not yet over, and in the years to come, she would be certain to get the last word.
It's 7 counts of first-degree murder, 7 counts of robbery. But there's something else that needs to be told.
And now I know I'm in big with you, Lord. Real big, as I sit here with 7 deaths over my head.
In January 1992, Aileen Wuornos was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. She was 36 years old. Over the next 2 years, she would plead no contest to 3 other counts of murder and enter guilty pleas on 2 more.
She asked me to get it over. I thought, why would you volunteer for execution? And I know the answer. The answer is because you're going to sit in a little 7-by-9 room for the next 20 years until all your appeals are done.
By now, Wuornos claimed that she had found God.
All I know what her good side was, that she believed in God, believed in the Lord, and she was going to heaven.
She lived and breathed with her Bible, because in the Bible were the answers to her questions, how do you get to God?
Despite her push to be executed, Wuornos would have to wait on death row while her automatic appeals were exhausted. She tried to fill her time by reading her Bible and drawing scenic pictures with a blue ink pen. Arlene Pralley, the born-again Christian who had adopted Wuornos, dropped out of her life after Wuornos accused her of trying to profit from her case.
She started her drawings to her and all that. But Arlene was saving all of them, actually, because she was going to have a museum and sell Eileen's products.
Dawn Botkins, who had known Aileen since they were teenagers, remained her closest friend. Aileen wrote her constantly, sometimes 4 letters a day.
I never asked her why she killed those guys or anything. I was her life outside. I gave her life. I gave her all the pictures, included her in my life, and gave her snow, and gave her sun, and gave her the ocean.
There's a limit to what you can do when you're in lockdown 23 hours a day. And with Aileen, she was exposed to very few people. She was very lonely. She was starved for human contact.
In July 2001, Aileen Wuornos, at the age of 45, appeared before Circuit Judge Michael Hutchison to ask the state to stop her mandated appeals and proceed with her death sentence.
So you do wish to, in essence, fire CCRC, terminate their representation?
Absolutely, and stop the using taxpayers' money and stuff like that. It's just ridiculous.
In her bid to be executed, she told the court that the murders were not an act of self-defense, as she had once contended.
I want to come clean and tell the world I killed those men first degree. Robbed and killed them to keep from any witnesses.
But before going to her death, in a jailhouse interview with Orlando's WESH-TV, she tried to place some of the blame on police. In fact, 3 detectives were investigated for seeking out movie deals before her trial.
Society needs to know, and they need to investigate. Even if I'm dead and gone, they need to find out about. I think the cops knew who I was and let me become a serial killer.
She really believed they had set her up, that they wanted her so bad, that they wanted to be in Hollywood and to be, in her terms, rich and famous, that they were willing to let innocent people die in order to promote themselves. She believed that.
On April 1st, 2002, the Florida Supreme Court upheld Aileen Wuornos' request to end her appeals. Her execution was scheduled for October. She wrote that she used the time to try and make things right with God.
I come to you as best I can in memory of my life of sins.
She listed her many transgressions, but once again, she blamed her descent into murder in part on others, including her ex-lover, Tyra Moore.
I'd meet Ty, who'd influenced me into such an experience, as I'd then wind up smoking, drinking, and cussing more than I've ever done before, just heading further in evil.
Dawn Botkins visited Wuornos in prison the night before her execution.
It was a hard walk in, but it was even a harder walk out. And I told the guard, I said, can you open that door a little quicker? Because I don't want to look back, or all you could hear is saying, I love you, Dawn. I'll see you on the other side. And I said, I love you too. I thought, don't look back.
On October 9th, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was put to death by lethal injection at the age of 46. Her strange final words, I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus, June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all, I'll be back.
That was her way of talking about God. Plus, it baffled the world, didn't it? She got the last word.
After the execution, Wuornos was cremated. Dawn brought the ashes back to Michigan.
I planted this tree for her, and then I put her ashes right here. After all that she's been through in Florida and she has done to Florida, she needed to be home here amongst the ones that loved her. And that's where she is.
Aileen Wuornos' life was tragic. Some people have come from much worse circumstances and certainly not turned into what she became. So there's no excuse for what happened.
I don't think Lee ever figured out why she couldn't make her life work. She knew it didn't work, but she never could figure out why.
It makes me sad, and it makes me cry, and it makes me hurt. But then you think of the victims, and you think of those. They were uncles, and they were fathers, and they were people too.
Lord God, I pray you'll forgive me and bring me home eternal evermore. Amen.